Well, hello everybody and welcome to Unpacked Lunch this Wednesday afternoon. Let us know in the comments what you're having for lunch. As always, we just want to know we're on the chat as well, so we'll be able to say hello to you. Steve, welcome to you.
Thank you, Jonny.
We are in a series at the moment called Curious, and so if you haven't been part of the series so far, and if you haven't watched online, just really want to encourage you to maybe hop onto YouTube after this and check out the series. It's a great one. It's a great one to share as well if you've got people who are maybe curious about faith and wondering what faith is all about. But we are in week 3, and Steve, I'm going to ask you some questions around a little bit of what we spoke about, or what Leon spoke about on Sunday. And so the question was, who is Jesus? Right. We titled it The Big Ask, because we thought it's the biggest question you can possibly ask. We're that creative here at the Forge. And so we had that sort of question around actually how it's not, the question isn't as much about a what and a how as much as it is a who and a why. And we looked at who Jesus was, who he claimed to be, who different people saw him to be. I kind of want to ask some questions around, if we went back in time and if we saw Jesus, who would we probably see him as? What would be the kind of things that we'd see?
I think that everyone would view him as a rabbi, as in one of the leaders who would bring the teaching of God to people. And so often you'll get in the accounts of Jesus, people will come up and say, Rabbi. And that was the term, that was the role that he had from about the age of 30 onwards, because that was the culture of the day, that there would be these rabbis who would travel around and they would bring their teaching to the people so that people could follow God correctly. And that's who I think people would have seen him to be.
Great. Hey, when I was younger, we had a speaker who referred to the rabbis as the rabies. And I'm not sure if he did it on purpose or not, but I can always remember the rabbis now as the rabies.
The rabies,
and I'm sure that's probably something.
They were ones to be avoided then,
I
weren't
was
they?
going to say, not ones that you particularly wanted to follow. And so talk us a little bit around, so what would it involve following a rabbi? What would that look like as such?
Sure. The culture of the day was that children, in going to school, they didn't have schools like we would have. They would have gone to the synagogue. And there at the synagogue, there would have been a rabbi who would then teach these 6-year-olds, 6 through to about the age of 10, to memorize, because this is the Jewish custom, this is the Jewish way of living. They would memorize the first 5 books that we have in the Bible, of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So you could ask a 9-year-old and they would be able to recite word for word those 5 books. It was quite extraordinary. And that's how, in their culture, that's how they were trained to do it. Because, of course, not everyone had those, like we have the Bible today. We can just pull it off the shelf and quickly refer to it. Of course, these were scrolls, these were copies, and the various synagogues would only have certain editions of or copies of those. And so, they were taught to memorize it. The term, it was the house, oh my God, I have to look at it here now. It was called the house of the book, the Bet Sefer. The Bet Sefer. That's right.
So I feel like on Unpacked we've recently started to give people new language and just new words that they can drop in conversation. Right. Hey, 10 points if you manage to fit Bet Sefer into conversation with someone.
That's right, which basically means the house of the book. Now, this comes from 2 different sources that I've kind of come across this. One was from a guy called Rob Bell in his book called Velvet Elvis, which I'm doing with a bunch of guys at the moment in my small group, but also through the Beimar podcasts, which is looking at the Bible from an Eastern viewpoint rather than a Western viewpoint of how we view it. And so kind of both concur on the kind of the background of this. And so at the age of 10, some children would then leave to become apprentices of the family business. So they would become whatever.
So you'd be a farmer. I'd be a saxophonist.
Absolutely, right. Yes, that's right. Right. So we would start learning from 10, and basically that was the end of our schooling, and we'd have memorized the first 5 books, and then we would start our apprenticeship of the family business, and girls would likewise go back home to learn how to run a household. So there would be this learning from the family. But those who were good enough, those who had really grasped this, and that the rabbi would see they had more potential, they were invited to stay on for another 4 years, from the ages of 10 to 14. And then that was known as the Bet Talmud. And the Bet Talmud basically means a house of learning. And
Bet Safar, Bet Talmud.
that's right. And with the Bet Talmud, they would then learn the rest of the Old Testament scriptures. So that's 39 books off by heart.
I'll tell you what, if I had to learn that much, I think I'd be in a Bet Talmud.
Yeah, it is quite incredible. But again, you see, their culture, their upbringing, their minds were trained this way to memorize. And so that by the age of 14, those who were good enough had remembered from Genesis going all the way through to Malachi. Quite incredible. And then, basically at that point, those that had only just managed it, or who had struggled to get there, basically they were then released back to the apprenticeship with the father or the mother, and into the family business again. But when the rabbi saw someone, or saw a few of those young people who were just exceptional, they really were the best of the best of the best, then they would be invited to stay on and to learn from a rabbi. And so these top people, these Oxford University, Cambridge University people as such, okay, at the age of 14, they would then talk with a rabbi and say, "Can I follow you?" And the rabbi would then just invest time talking with them and asking them questions, because to become a disciple of a rabbi, basically it wasn't just to know what they knew, and it wasn't just to be able to do what they did, it was to be like who they were. So in other words, that they could become like the rabbi. And so the rabbi would ask all of these questions. And if they felt that, yes, this person could become like me, not just knowing what I know and doing what I'm doing, but become like me, then they would say, "Come, follow me." And so the best of the best would then become disciples of a rabbi. And as the rabbi would travel around and teach, you'd get these little bunch of younger people who would be following so closely because they didn't want to miss anything that the rabbi was doing. And so in some literature, it speaks about, when the rabbi went to the toilet, that the followers, the disciples, would go and watch to see what was there anything special that he was doing. It's gross, isn't it? But basically, they didn't want to miss anything.
Does he sit or does he stand?
That's
that kind
right.
of it? Yeah, right.
I know.
So that was in my head. I couldn't.
That's right. I know. And so they would speak about walking in the dust of the rabbi because they wanted to be that close to learn from them. And so when it comes to Jesus, we don't know the route that Jesus took. But at the age of 6, almost certainly, he would have gone to the synagogue and he would have memorized the Torah. It's very likely that he would have moved on to the Bet Talmud at the time of learning the whole of the scriptures of the Old Testament, all 39 books. But then it's probably at that point that he chose to go back to join his family rather than come under another rabbi, to become a disciple of another rabbi. It's likely because we get the account that he was a carpenter. And so that's what Joseph was. And so he'd obviously gone back at some point to fulfill the kind of the family business and to do that. But what the few accounts that we have of Jesus' early life, one of them is when he went to the temple in Jerusalem at the age of 12. And they went for all the usual celebrations that were happening there. And then there was a whole crowd of them. And Mary and Joseph were probably split up as they were making their way back. And Joseph thought that Jesus was with Mary. Mary thought that Jesus was with Joseph. And so this whole community were going back to Nazareth. and Jesus had been left behind. And so after a while, they were saying, where is he? Where is he? They couldn't find him. So they then had to make their way back. And when they made their way back, they found Jesus in the temple. And he's talking with the various religious leaders and rabbis. And they said that they were amazed at his questions and his wisdom. And so, in other words, at that point of his learning, Jesus, there was something exceptional about him that those religious leaders recognized. But we know that he went back to his family business because he was a carpenter up until the age of 30. And disciples of rabbis, on the whole, if they were to become rabbis themselves, it would be around the age of 30. And what would happen is that two rabbis would then have to give the authority for that person to step up from being a disciple to being a rabbi themselves, taking on the teaching, the yoke, as it was called. It was the rabbi's interpretation of the Bible, of those 39 books of the Old Testament. They would take that and then would start teaching that themselves. And so Jesus, that didn't quite happen in the same way, because he wouldn't have gone and been a disciple under another rabbi. Basically, it appears that his authority to become a rabbi was from John the Baptist. So at the start of his ministry, what's the first thing that happens? Well, John the Baptist, that's right, he gets baptized, and John the Baptist, speaks about, look, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He recognized there was something so significant about who Jesus was, and he baptizes him. And so that was, in a sense, John giving authority for Jesus to become a rabbi. And then also it says that a dove descended from heaven, and they heard the voice of God saying, "This is my son, with whom I'm well pleased." And so he had this double authority of John the Baptist and of God himself setting him to go into the ministry of being a rabbi, of teaching the word of God and calling people to follow him.
That's amazing. Imagine just getting to the point of learning the 39 books and then being told you're not good enough.
Not good enough, I know.
And you're like, because you missed the last two words or something like that. Or like Malachi.
Yeah.
So you've already mentioned around how Jesus wasn't perhaps the traditional rabbi. And so the way in perhaps he got into the rabbihood, is that the way? The rabbihood? Maybe not. The way... definitely not the way he got rabies.
No.
The way he became a rabbi wasn't the traditional manner.
No.
And actually the way he was a rabbi from that point onwards wasn't particularly traditional either.
No. And so again, normally a rabbi would have these young people coming up to them and saying, "Can I be your disciple?" They would question, and if he felt they were good enough, they could become like him, then they would say, "Now come follow me." Jesus didn't have that, but right at the very start of his ministry, at the start of the Gospels, each one of the Gospels, you'll find him calling people to follow him. Now, so he goes to Peter and he goes to Andrew and he says, "Come follow me," and they stop what they're doing and they go and follow Jesus. If they weren't following another rabbi, it meant one thing. It meant that they weren't good enough. They hadn't been good enough, so they'd gone back to the family business. It then speaks about James and John, who were fishermen, who were with their father. So these were still apprentices. They hadn't got their own fishing company. These were still apprentices. So these would have been either teens or 20s. And Jesus says to them, "Come follow me." And you kind of think, well, they drop everything. They leave their nets and they go and follow Jesus. That is weird. But actually, in that culture, of course not. If a rabbi said, "Come follow me," it's a little bit like Pep Guardiola going out to some kids on the street in Manchester and just saying, "Come and be part of Man City Football Club and I'll make you Premiership footballers." Well, which one of those I go, "Well, I'm not really sure. I don't." Do you know what I mean? They would just die for it. Because the opportunity was so unexpected, because they weren't good enough. And here was a rabbi saying, "I believe," and this is extraordinary. Jesus was saying to Peter and Andrew and James and John, "I believe that you can become like me." And so no wonder they dropped everything and went to follow him. And so that's why you get these stories of Jesus traveling around and the disciples following him. That for us just seems weird. Because, where are my little disciples? I'm a church leader,
Yeah.
and but that's not our culture. In that culture, it was so it was so common. And so, wherever Jesus went, of course, the disciples were watching closely all the time, which is why they said, how can you pray like you do? Will you teach us how to pray? And so then Jesus teaches them the Lord's Prayer and gives them the Lord's Prayer. Why? Because they've seen something about their rabbi that they want to have, but they don't know how to get it. And so they ask the questions. And it's so I think when we think of Jesus, we think of the Son of God, we think of the Messiah, we think of God here in human form. Of course, for people then, they would have seen him as a religious leader and teacher, a rabbi.
It makes the story of the disciples after Jesus so compelling now, though, isn't it? When you understand that, and when you see how closely they would have followed him, the fact that they were willing to die for who they said that Jesus was. Like, if you followed for someone for that long, for 3 years, that closely, that intensely, with that much almost sacredness, like the fact you're willing to die for that, like, you don't die for a fraud, you don't die for someone who you're like, actually I followed that guy and actually it was probably a bit of a waste of my life, kind of thing. Like, it was
absolutely. So without the resurrection, they would have they were going to go back to their old work, weren't they? So Peter, when he'd seen Jesus die, what does he do? He goes fishing again. That's all he knows. That's all he knows. And so he goes fishing, and of course then you get this amazing story of Jesus on the beach, and he's cooking breakfast for them, and he calls out, how many fish have you got? And Peter says, we haven't caught anything. He says, throw the net the other side. As soon as the net is full, Peter realizes who it is. And that strange story where Peter then puts on his coat and jumps into the water and goes across, and Jesus reinstates him and says, Peter, do you love me? And in a sense, that's his recommissioning to say, come on, Peter, you can be like me.
That's amazing. And so that whole process is extraordinary and sort of ancient. If we went back in the time machine, that's what we'd see. How is that good for us to know now? Like, how is that transferable? How should we act in response to that?
This I just find mind-blowing. I really do. That Jesus looked at Peter and James and John and Andrew and his other disciples, and he believed in them. He believed in them enough that they could become like him. And even though they were not good enough in the eyes of other religious leaders and stuff. And so for me, God looks at me and I know that I'm not good enough. I just know it. And he does too. And most other people do as well. And Jesus says to me, come on, Steve, follow me. Follow me, because he believes in me. And he believes that I can be like him, that I can have a love like him, that I can be compassionate like him, that I can love others like him. And that's immense faith in me when I know what I'm like. But he knows the transformation that the Holy Spirit can bring to my life to make me more like Jesus. And so for anyone who's watching, his call for us, we never have to think we're not good enough, because Jesus calls the not good enough and says, come follow me. Come follow me and you can become like me. And Rob Bell, in his book, Velvet Elvis, he finishes off this little section by saying, we always think that it's about us having faith in God, but actually it's about God having faith in us. That it's not just about us believing in God, it's that God believes in us and he believes that we can be like him. And so if that's the case, I want to run after that. I want to run after being like Jesus. I want to stay close to him so that I can learn from him, so that my life then reflects him and I take his teaching, his yoke on myself. And so I follow what it is that he teaches. And that's available for every single one of us. That's why asking the question, who is Jesus? Who do I think that Jesus is? He was a rabbi. He was. That's an answer. But he's more than a rabbi, because he's one who died, who rose again, and who says, Steve, Johnny, Brenda, come follow me, because I believe in you. I have faith in you that you can become like me.
Hey, and that feels like a good place to stop, because we're going to be looking at that this coming week on Curious. And so really want to encourage you to log in, as always, 10:30 on Sunday, and watch with us, be part of us as we do church together in these strange times. But if you haven't seen any of the Curious episodes, maybe that's just given you a little bit of a nudge to maybe check them out. Or maybe if you haven't shared the Curious episodes yet, we'd really want to encourage you to do that. They are available as single episodes, so that you don't have to watch the whole service if you don't want to send that over. If you just want to send sort of a neat sort of 15-20 minute chunk to a friend, really want to encourage you to do that, and I'll make sure to put the link as usual below as well. So I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Really glad that you've been joining us on Unpacked Lunch, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.